Hey everybody, welcome back. And after the incredible response that I received from the discussion that I had with Chris Stuckman about 2001 A Space Odyssey, I thought I would kind of keep that momentum going and introduce a new show called Classic Cinema Spotlight. For this, I'm going to bring on a special guest and discuss the classic film of their choice. So, naturally, the first person that I had in mind to have on this show was author, host of Turner Classic Movies and Filmstruck, and someone I am proud to call my friend, Alicia Malone. How you doing today, Alicia?
Hi, I'm very honored that I'm your first guest. This is exciting.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I just crossed about like 1,500 subscribers, so welcome to the big leagues.
Hey, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Congrats.
So I'm actually pretty excited to talk about this film. This is a movie that I'm shocked that I haven't seen because I've seen the most recent Kong film, Skull Island. The one that I was watched when I was a kid. My first experience to King Kong was the 2005 Peter Jackson version, and I also have seen the Jessica Lange and Jeff Bridges version. So it really seems like the only theatrical King Kong film that's focused on solely him is this movie that I haven't seen. What is it about this film that made you want to talk about this?
Well, I think because it is such an iconic film, being the original King Kong movie from 1933, I was really intrigued to hear from you, who I guess hadn't seen this film, what you thought about it, given that it has so many moments that have become iconic, particularly the moment of King Kong on top of the Empire State Building. And also intrigued to hear from you what you thought about the animation because the special effects. Because at the time they were really groundbreaking. It's funny now to watch them. I mean, Kong is not very scary in this day and age.
Well, watching this film, I'm a sucker for stop motion animation. Kubo and the Two Strings and Isle of Dogs recently, they blow my mind how astounding the craftsmanship is. And I'm reminded by Roger Ebert, who has a great quote about stop motion animation. He says that stop motion looks fake but feels real, but CGI looks real but feels fake. And I totally agree with that
That's
because
true.
you can really
Yeah.
feel, especially in this film, one of the common quote unquote criticisms of this film that a lot of people have is you can see the thumbprints and the handling of this little figurine. But with many other people, I think that kind of adds to the charm of it because you can see the craftsmanship that is involved with that. And especially looking when this film came out, there are some shots in this film that I thought were incredibly impressive. There's one where he's holding Fay Ray in his hand, and they kind of splice the two of the claymation figure and then her. They're both in the shot. It's really impressive stuff. For being a 1933 film, you could color me impressed to say the least.
Yeah, good. I'm so glad because I really like the handmade quality of the animation. And it still impresses me to watch it and think that it was made back at this time and to read about how they did it behind the scenes, where they had a giant hand that Fay Ray was inside of, and they put that up on a crane, but apparently over the shoot it would just loosen, the grip would loosen around her a little bit. So many of those scenes, she later said she was actually terrified during them because she was worried she was going to fall out of this giant hand and injure herself or worse. So it was pretty dangerous stuff. There were a lot of stunts that hadn't been tried before. And I love the scenes with Kong fighting all the different prehistoric animals, dinosaurs, lizards, these giant, pterodactyls. I think it's so great to see these two big creatures set against the real world that they inhabit. I think it is super impressive for 1933.
Yeah, well, Fay Ray was somebody that stood out to me within this film. She is kind of like the original Scream Queen. There's that great scene where she's on the boat and she's being directed by I think it's Robert Armstrong is his name. And he's like, and then now you see him and scream, and she lets out this blood curdling scream. But she's really incredible in this film. I think she fits this role to a T, and I think she offers more than just to be what the filmmakers of the fictional film are looking for, which is just a pretty face.
Yeah, just a pretty face. And there's funny. It's the whole scene at the start of the film of, oh, why do we need a girl? Why do we need a woman on the boat? They're just trouble.
Yeah,
And
I couldn't
but
tell.
they say we need a woman.
I couldn't tell if it was a parody or not. I couldn't tell if they were kind of making fun of Hollywood or if this was just kind of a product of its time.
I think it's probably a product of its time,
Oh, man.
and they're just like, women are trouble. And then, oh, but we need one. The critics and audiences say my films would be better if we had a love story. And then he goes to pretty much a homeless shelter, a women's mission to look for someone, and then leaves that and then finds Fay Wray's character on the verge of hunger, about to faint. But yeah, I agree that she shows much more gumption than the character than they thought that she had in her. And I think Fay Wray as well brought so much more to that character than Hollywood thought of. She was only paid $10,000 for this role and she wasn't paid any royalties. So she got paid that $10,000 over 10 weeks. So it wasn't much money, not compared to her male co-stars in the film. And she did bring so much, including those incredible lungs. She has one of the most iconic screams of movie history.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think something that a lot of people bring up nowadays with films that rely heavily on CG, and like one that comes to mind is like The Jungle Book. They're like, wow, this kid did such a great job acting to nothing. And I think with Faye's performance, she is somebody that is almost kind of a pioneer to that, having to not only just be scared of this creature, but to have a semi relationship with it, and to be able to convey some sort of sympathy with this creature. I think she should get more credit than she deserves. Way more than $10,000. Yeah.
I agree. She deserves much more credit because, like you said, the character, and it's that iconic line at the very end of the movie, it was beauty that killed the beast. The character of Kong falls for her, and you see him being very callous towards other people, other women. He doesn't care. He's looking specifically for her when he goes to New York. And so she has to set up this relationship where she's terrified of Kong, but she also starts to realize that he is not going to hurt her. But at the same time, she wants to get away. And then when she comes back in New York to stand in front of him and, pose for photos and sort of feel a bit of sympathy towards him being chained up, at the same time knowing what he's capable of. And I just always think, as someone who's really scared of heights, that character, what she goes through, so traumatic. How do you ever get over that whole experience? First in the jungle and then in New York, being held up, right up the top of Empire State Building. It just makes my toes tingle and my palms sweat. I can't think of anything worse.
You had mentioned the scene in New York and kind of how callous he is to the other people. I had mentioned this to you, but I was shocked at how vicious this film is. For being in the 30s, and especially watching as many classics as I kind of have been rapid fire, this movie's way violent. Like, he picks up some people, just kind of like gnaws on them a little bit, and then just like throws them to the ground and steps on them, just tosses people like they're dirty laundry. I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to watch this film and the films that were made during this pre-code era, as they call them. There's a period of about 4 years between all the movie studios signing an agreement about this new censorship, this new production code that would come in, because movies started to get way more violent and they started to get very sexy, and a lot of groups, particularly the Catholic Legion of Decency, were very upset by this. So they wanted to have some restrictions on filmmakers about what they could and couldn't show. So they signed the agreement, and then there was a period about 4 years between when it was signed and when it was enforced, and that's when filmmakers really let loose. So when you see a film from 1933 or 1931, 1932, it is always surprising. You see these movies that have nudity, that talk about sex openly, and the thing that's surprising is because it suddenly changed completely. So the movies that you see in the late 30s and the 40s, throughout the 50s into the early 60s, were very much they couldn't really talk explicitly about sex. They couldn't show any homosexual characters. They couldn't have a lot of violence. You didn't really see a lot of blood or see a lot of death on screen, and people were punished much more for their actions. if they were immoral. So it's always very surprising to watch these movies and realize that, back in the 30s, things were quite violent and sexual on screen.
Mm-hmm. Well, something that I didn't know about this film, and I had watched a documentary about this movie, and I found it so fascinating. It talks about the legacy of not just this film, but King Kong in general. I didn't know that this film was written by numerous people, but the person that supposedly had contributed the most to the story. Her name is Ruth Rose. Now, I didn't know that essentially the person who is the beating heart of this film in terms of its story was a woman. And I think when you watch the film kind of retroactively, knowing that there's a lot of things that really do make sense. She is, whether the fictional filmmakers in this movie want her to be, the focus of it. And as I said, she's not just a pretty face. She has this relationship with this creature, this completely fictionalized creature. And even in the 30s, with just little claymation figures, they were able to really convey a real heart to this film. There's a deep beating pulse throughout this movie. And I think it's trying to give this very humanitarian narrative. Is there any deeper meaning that you derive from this film?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot you can look into. I definitely feel sympathy for the character of Kong. He's just hanging out on his island and, doing his own thing. And then he gets, and you see him protect Fay Wray's character from all these other beasts, dangerous island that he lives on. And then for him to be gassed and taken to New York and then held up in front of this crowd as something to be looked at and gawked at, I think it definitely has an undertone of animal rights and talking about, whether animals should be treated lesser than humans. I know that you could do a whole reading into the film about racism as well. There was a lot of people saying it's quite racist, that the Kong character is supposed to be representative of African Americans, stealing and the poor white woman that gets in the way, but and also the native people and the treatment of the native people there. But I think as far as its legacy, it's about the movie monster, and the movie monster traditionally has always been a being that you feel sympathy for, whether it's Dracula or Frankenstein. They're often just these misunderstood outsider characters that want some connection with people but aren't allowed it because they are considered monsters and they're treated badly by society, and often they're pushed to the limit of having to be violent in return, in revenge for it.
Yeah, you had mentioned the illusion of racism in this film, and there was a scene that I think stood out to myself. It's when they first encounter this tribe, and they're kind of peering behind like a tree, and the director is like, "Oh, this would be a great shot," and just pulls out his camera like in the middle of this path and just starts filming them living their lives and trying to go through this almost kind of ritual. And I think that kind of mentality is something that perhaps could carry over to today, of how we view these foreign natures, not really as people, but as almost like a petri dish that we're trying to dissect and trying to really understand just gawk at what is happening. I think that this film taking, even if it's not intentional, the way that I had perceived it, I think that it's a gutsy move from this film, and I think that's because of things like that and so many other things that this film has such a withstanding legacy. Now, what is it about this movie that you think stands taller than other films like Mighty Joe Young or the original The Lost World? Like, what is it about this film that you think even to 2017 we're getting more installments into this franchise?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's I always love looking at the original of anything, because you could definitely make arguments that future Kong movies that have been made since the 1933 version have been superior in one way or another. but I love looking at where it all started and to just see something that has taken on a life of its own. Because I think even if you've never seen King Kong or any Kong movies, you know the images in the film. You'll know basically what it's about because it is larger than what it is. It's become very iconic. The Empire State Building at the time was pretty new, and then it was still quite a new phenomenon, and this helped it to become even more iconic in the New York skyline. And we've seen that image of Kong on the side of the building so often. So I love that. I think it still holds up as a film. I think there's so many different layers to it. I think the actors are all pretty good. It moves at a good pace and has a lot of action scenes in there. And so I just love to look at it as a fascinating piece of history. It was re-released in 1938, where that was after the production code came in. And so they cut out a lot of the scenes, a lot of the violence, and a lot of the stuff that happens in New York, which is a real shame. So I'm glad that we can now see the original 33 version the way it was supposed to be seen.
I think it's all those reasons, in addition to the fact that not only being re-released in 1938, but this is a film that had been replayed and over again on television, much like Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz, or a number of those films that people would huddle around the TV and watch this movie with their family. And I think that not only that, but this film, as you said, the iconography of it, you can see something like the recent Spielberg film Ready Player One and just get 1 second glimpse of a monkey on an Empire State Building and you go, that's King Kong. It doesn't even have to be that they say, oh, it's King Kong. Everybody just knows that that is who it is. And I think not just that, but this film moves at an incredibly brisk pace. I think a lot of people can give classic films this unfair stigma of being a little boring or slow, and I think that if you're going to show somebody that could potentially be timid because it's in black and white, ooh, scary, but this is a film that you could show them and say, no, this is a very incredibly exciting film about this 20-foot tall monkey fighting these pterodactyls and these T-Rex, and he's capturing this girl and planes are shooting at him. It's a very gripping movie, but not just that, but the fact that these characters are layered. They're not just, oh, the monster takes the damsel in distress. I think that these characters have layers to them, and there's some certain subtext that makes this movie have a real legacy.
Yeah, I agree. And selfishly, with you, I always love to hear what you think of these classic films, because often I encountered these movies when I was young or a teenager or in my 20s trying to learn more about classics. So I love to hear from people who've seen it for the first time. And I'm like, oh, what did you think? Because it's a different time now, and like you said, lots of people do think classic films are boring, and sometimes they do have a slow pace to them compared to today, but they're classics for a reason, and these stories are timeless and have been copied so often. And I love seeing, like I said, the original of anything. And I think if you love movies and if you want to talk about films, then it gives you a really solid base to work from if you can see where everything started, and then you start to notice the patterns, you start to notice the influences. Everything's influenced by what came before it. So yeah, I always love hearing from you when you've seen a classic movie.
Well, I'll keep you up to date on the classics that I watch, but thank you so much for joining me today on my very first episode. I loved having you here. Is there anything that you would like to plug? Anything coming up? Maybe a hardcover version of something that you made?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. Yes, the hardcover version of my book, Backwards and in Heels, is now available. Hey, Garrett's holding up his copy right there. And so for the hardcover, I got to update some things because obviously since the paperback came out in August, much has happened around women in Hollywood. So I did an updated chapter, and also Rose McGowan wrote a foreword for me, which was really lovely. I fixed a few typos that annoyed me from the first paperback. So that is available now on Amazon. And I'm actually writing a second book right now, which is going to be a collection of movies made by women. So just a good base to start, 30 films that I've picked from all different eras and all different countries, all directed by women, that are really interesting to watch for one reason or another. So I'm working on that now, and hopefully that'll be out towards the end of the year.
I gotta know. Can you give us a little tease? Is American Psycho in the list?
It is,
Yay!
yes.
Awesome. One of my
Because
favorite films.
it's such a great example of, a female director doing a horror film, and one that is quite masculine at the same time. So yeah, I love that movie.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for joining me on my very first episode. And thank you guys for watching today. And I hope you liked today's video. If you did, you can click on the link down below and subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews, movie related things. And guys, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.